The following is a DW Old Testament production. In the last episode, we focused on an introduction to the world of biblical Israel and discussed the outline and chronology of the Hebrew civilization. We begin at the beginning in this episode as we focus on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books of Moses. The topics of this episode include the 4 sources of the Pentateuch, an overview of Genesis chapters 1 through 11, the priestly creation story, the Yahwist creation story, the Cain and Abel story, the giants born of sin, Noah in the flood, and the buildup to the Patriarchs. Here's a quick overview of the first books of the Bible. Genesis opens with the history of creation and the earliest human societies told in mythological forms. It then moves on to the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, who receive Yahweh's promise and carry out his plans. Exodus tells the story of Moses and the deliverance of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. The book closes with detailed descriptions for the building of the Tent of Meeting and the Ark of the Covenant. Leviticus contains the laws and commandments that God gave to his newly sanctified people. The regulations deal mostly with sacrifices, feasts, priesthood, and the ritual obligations. Numbers adds many more laws and regulations. Chapters 10 through 20 continue the story of Israel's wanderings in the desert, complete with a 40-year punishment for constantly rebelling against God and Moses. Deuteronomy, meaning the second law in Greek, is a later book composed entirely as a reflective speech of Moses that sums up the meaning of the Exodus and the desert journey, and reaffirms the importance of the covenant law as a guide for Israel's life in the Promised Land. It also contains Moses' farewell speech that takes place just as the people are ready to invade the Promised Land. At least from the post-exilic period, after 539 BC, Moses has been explicitly identified as the author of the first 5 books. These books frequently mention that Moses gave laws and instructions to the people, and the book of Deuteronomy begins with the statement that it was the words of Moses spoken beyond the Jordan. By the time of Christ, not only Jesus, but other well-known Jewish authors such as Josephus the historian and Philo the Jewish philosopher of Alexandria take for granted that Moses authored the first 5 books. But even in ancient times, there were those who doubted that Moses could have written the whole thing. Such passages as Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 5 through 12, which records Moses' death, were often cited to show that Moses did not write all of the content. It was commonly believed that his faithful follower Joshua had added that section. But what does a scientific observation reveal about the authorship? A detailed examination reveals that these books are full of repetitions and contradictions that strongly indicate a lack of style by a single author. At first, scholars thought there were only 2 earlier documents, one called the Yahwist source and the other the Elohist source, based on the way each referred to God's name. But it soon became clear that Genesis and the Exodus also contained a priestly cast to it, against the other that contained many of the old stories involving historical traditions. Now there were 3 sources, and it didn't take long to identify a 4th. The unique style of the book of Deuteronomy set it apart from the other 3. These 4 sources are called by their first letters J, E, P, and D. The J instead of the Y comes from the German word Yahweh, for it was German scholars who first proposed the abbreviations. It was Julius Wellhausen in 1878 who broke down the narrative sources for the first 5 books. A brief sketch of his work will show the proposed development in which the early and mostly oral traditions of Israel were gradually written down, preserved in 4 written documents, and then combined to make one Pentateuch. According to this theory, The first source, the J source, was composed from oral tradition during the times of King Solomon. When Solomon died and the nation split into a northern kingdom, which called itself Israel, the northerners needed a revised version of the traditions, which would not glorify Jerusalem and the kings of the southern kingdom, Judah. They produced a second and revised account of the old traditions, which used Elohim as God instead of Yahweh, and place names that were more familiar to their part of the country. They also stressed the role of the covenant of Moses over the role of the king, and avoided much of the Yahwist's intimate language about God walking and talking with man. They favored instead a more spiritualized sense of God's dealings with Israel. These two accounts, known as the J and E source, existed side by side as long as the two kingdoms lasted. When the north fell to the Assyrians in 722 BC, the northerners who fled south carried their written Elohist source with them. The J and E documents were then combined as one during the following century for the people who lived now only in Judah. At the same time, there arose a group of priests, Levites, and prophets who attempted to reform many bad practices of the faith in Judah. Out of their efforts came the book of Deuteronomy, known as the D source. The Deuteronomist reformers collected covenant legal traditions and added them to sermons, stressing obedience and faithfulness to the covenant if the people were to receive blessings in the promised land. Although created out of the best of both northern and southern traditions during the long period from Hezekiah through Josiah, it was only discovered hidden away in the temple when Josiah began his reforms in 622 BC. The king and people alike recognized its authority and genuine Mosaic style, and D was joined with J and E as part of the nation's sacred traditions. Finally, when the entire country went into exile under the Babylonians in 597 to 586 BC, a school of priests seemed to have gathered many of the cultic and legal traditions together. This included the lists of ancestors preserved in the temple, the isolated stories and traditions not found in earlier works, and most of the great law collections in Leviticus and Numbers. The priestly work, called P, thus formed a fourth source, which made the earlier historical accounts more complete and, at the same time, set forth new conditions under the law that would allow Israel's covenant with God to last even when there was no land or temple or king. According to Wellhausen, these four sources were finally edited by the priestly school into the Pentateuch after the exile ended in 539 BC to create the Torah, or the Pentateuch. With this said, the oldest sources we have are the Yahwist and Elohist versions, J and E. The Yahwist represents a primitive anthropomorphic view of God filled with magical appearances and mythical details. The writer of J brought together old poems, stories, and songs of the Exodus that were alive in the oral traditions, particularly those favoring stories from Judah. The Yahwist created more than a story of Israel's past. He created a theology and a purpose that explained the religious faith and special spirit of the nation. The Elohist, while favoring northern ideas, shows a deeper awareness of God's distance. The Deuteronomist reflects the later and more sensitive concern of the prophets to the ethical demands and oneness of God over the whole world. Finally, the priestly source brings together the complex institutional and legal aspects of Israelite faith that would support a life of fidelity to the covenant through exile and time of loss. In contrast to the JEDP theory, there is an alternative approach to the biblical sources. Dr. Gary Rensburg, professor of Jewish studies at Rutgers University, accepts the obvious differences between P and D and recognizes that the laws and cultic material in the Torah emanate from these two distinct sources. However, he does not follow that the one source, J, is earlier than the other source, E. Based on his research, he believes the two may be one, especially in Genesis, where the two divisions often complement each other to create the full story. Dr. Rensburg proves through linguistic analysis that the entirety of the Torah, and especially Genesis, is composed in classical biblical Hebrew, not late biblical Hebrew. The linguistic developments that one finds in the texts dated to the exile and beyond are not to be found in Genesis. During the Persian period, loan words from Persian entered the Hebrew language by the dozens, as can be seen by looking at the books of Esther, Ezra, and others from that period. However, not a single Persian loanword occurs in the 5 books of the Torah. With his approach, the P source, essentially the book of Leviticus, along with portions of Exodus and Numbers, and the D source, essentially the book of Deuteronomy, are contemporary and competing systems of law and worship in ancient Israel. So back to our question, did Moses write the Pentateuch? The short answer is actually yes, mostly. Although Moses did not write the Pentateuch as a complete source, as it contains several sources, many of its traditions, legal practices, and covenant forms date back to his time, and their central importance for Israel may even have originated with him personally, but definitely with the community of the Exodus and the conquest. The book of Genesis covers a vast amount of time stretching from the beginning of the world to about 1500 BC. The authors of Genesis did not know about our current view of the world's age at about 4.5 billion years, nor would they have cared. They only wished to document a few highlights about human origins that had particular religious significance for Israel's view of life, and to record a few traditions about their own ancestors that would help them understand how they came to be a people and a nation. Their primeval history in Genesis chapters 1 through 11 can be broken down into several stages. These are the 2 creation accounts, Genesis 1 through 2, the fall of humanity into sin and punishment, Genesis 3 through 4, the list of ancient heroes from Adam to Noah, Genesis 4:17 through 5:32, the story of how giants were born due to sin, Genesis 6:1 through 4, the flood as punishment of that sin, Genesis 6:5 through 9:29, the new list of nations spread across the world, Genesis chapter 10, the sin of the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11:1 through 9, the list of patriarchs from Noah to Abraham, Genesis 11:10 through 32. This outline, in turn, belongs to 2 basic sources, the Yahwist and the priestly. The older of the 2 sources is, of course, J, who has joined together several old stories and myths and reworked them to fit the religious message about Yahweh. But it is only in the combination of both J and P together that the full richness of Hebrew thought on Hebrew beginnings is revealed. The P account of creation in 7 days is a brilliant beginning to the Old Testament. The creation itself unfolds in 6 days, carefully balanced into 3 days each. The first day, the creation of light. The second day, creation of heavens and water. Third day, creation of land and vegetation. Fourth day, creation of bodies of light. Fifth day, creation of creatures of heaven and water. Sixth day, creation of life and its vegetable food, with the creation of humankind. On the first 3 days, God creates the physical world and separates each part into its place. On the last 3 days, God populates the world with living creatures and assigns them their proper roles. The climax of the creative process is the human being, whom God makes male and female, blesses and appoints as those who have dominion over his new creation. The world this describes obviously doesn't share the same scientific view of the contemporary age, in which the Earth is one planet around one sun in a universe full of stars and planets. The ancient picture of the universe is much different. To the Hebrews, the Earth was a disk surrounded by water, not only on the sides, but underneath and above as well. A firm bowl, firmament, kept the upper waters back, but the sky had gates to let the rain, hail, and snow through. The sun, moon, and stars moved in fixed tracks along the underside of this bowl. From below the disk, the waters rose up in the form of wells, rivers, and oceans. The earth stood on firm pillars sunk into the waters, much like the pilings of a pier. Now deep below the earth was the abode of the dead, called Sheol, which could only be entered by the dead. This image of the world did not make the Hebrews unique. Many of the ancient civilizations around them believed the same layout of the world. Even the order of creation was similar to the Babylonians and their story of creation. Their account, called the Enuma Elish, was known from at least 1700 BC, long before the priestly account, and followed the same order of creation. While the priestly authors obviously knew the Babylonian story, or one similar, and used its outline, they did not accept its theology. Several differences were made. Most importantly, that the creation of man was made in God's image, as a place of honor, unlike the Babylonian account, which states that man has no purpose but to be the slaves of the gods. As noted by the historian Lawrence Boadt, the scope of Genesis 1:1 through 2:4 contains an entire portrait of the nature of Yahweh, the God of Israel, over against all pagan claims. Such a profound statement, a summary of what God can do, a guarantee that the story to follow makes sense. How close it comes to the wonder and praise expressed in Psalm 8. When I look up at the heavens, the work of your hands, the moon and the stars you have set in their place. What is man that you should remember him? Mortal man that you should care for him? Yet you have made him little less than a god, crowning him with glory and honor. You make him master over all your creatures. You have put everything under his feet. Psalm 8, verse 3 through 6. After the solemn tones of the priestly creative narrative, the reader notices a definite change in mood in the J story. Where the P account moves toward the creation of humanity as its climax, the J writer begins with God's creation of man and builds the account by creating a world for his new creature. J represents actually two stories. The first is the story of how God created one human being, but observed that he needed companions. The second story tells how God gave humans care over the Garden of Eden and made everything perfect for them. As in Genesis chapter 1, many elements are drawn from common myths of the ancient Near East. The tree of life is well known by the Babylonians as a symbol of long life or even immortality. The paradise garden in the East was known from Sumerian poems. The mystical power of the great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, was praised in many Babylonian hymns. A human becoming like God in wisdom after eating food reserved for gods was similar to a Mesopotamian myth called the legend of Adapa. The theology of the J account used all these elements from pagan myths to give a very Israelite message. Yahweh begins creation with the human species and then fashions a world that they are to cultivate and tend, and makes animals for them to rule over, and then establishes marriage and human community of two sexes to complement one another. Though the J account was quite different in style from that of P, the priestly editors found no difficulty incorporating the two together. The two sources of creation are to be read in tandem with the cosmocentric approach provided by Genesis 1 and the anthropocentric approach, as observed by man, presented in Genesis 2. This is the essence of ancient Israelite religion, the two working in sync together, the melding of the world of man in unique relationship with each other. Genesis chapter 3 is the story of the fall of man, the story of the Garden of Eden. The Yahwist creates a masterpiece of psychological insight as he presents the first couple with the temptation to be like God. The serpent in the tree hints that great things are possible and plays upon Eve's vanity. Both man and woman fall readily, despite their clear recognition that God had forbidden them to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They are not pictured as innocent babes in the woods, but as free adults, and so the sin is even greater. In true artistic manner, Jay has Yahweh hear out the defense of each in turn, then in reverse order address the serpent, the woman, and the man with the consequences of their actions. It is a dramatic scene which declares that the causes of sin and shame are rooted in human pride and disobedience, that humans are free to decide but must bear the consequences, and that we are not gods and must live now in a certain distance from God, outside his garden. But God remains tenderly concerned to make them adequate clothes, even as he expels them from the hopes of immortality. We have seen in our ancient Near East series how in the legend of Boadt, the hero loses his chance for immortality. The famous Babylonian story of Gilgamesh also explores this theme. The hero conquers all kinds of hurdles, but he cannot pass the final test needed for immortality, to simply stay awake. Most likely the J author was familiar with such stories, but he carefully avoids the position so often assumed by the pagan myths, that the gods purposely kept humans from immortality so there would be no great threat against the divine order. J asserts that we ourselves are to blame. God offered the gift, and if it did not turn out to be so, the reason can be found in human choice. The Garden of Eden account is how man gained knowledge, or the ability to obtain knowledge, and that is a trait which distinguishes man from the animal kingdom. Far being the fall of man, one could argue that we are dealing with the rise of man. However, keep in mind that man still violated God's command. By doing so, the author of Genesis chapters 2 through 3 introduces us to the concept of free will, a dominant motif in the Bible and in Judaism in general. The most significant factor is the choice between obeying God or one's own desires. It is the human struggle from the first couple until now. Besides these important themes of immortality and human sin, J addresses a host of other interesting questions about human life that the ancients had. Genesis chapters 2 through 3 explains why snakes crawl on the ground, why women have pain in childbirth, why people have to work for a living, why we wear clothes, why the sexes are different, why people are ashamed when naked, why we die, and why men and women feel sexual attraction to one another. We call these ideological stories because they explain the reasons for current names and customs. The ancient Israelites delighted in them as part of the tradition. One further note before moving on, the snake in Genesis chapter 3 is mainly a later Christian interpretation of Satan that is not present in the surface reading of the chapter. The snake is only described as the shrewdest of all wild beasts. The snake was certainly evil, but the actual Satan figure only becomes clearer during late Jewish theology, from which it passed into Christian belief. We'll discuss the origin of evil in a later episode. In Genesis chapter 4, we begin with the story of Cain and Abel. The biblical writer gives a dramatic example of how the alienation and sin of the garden spread to new levels of evil, not only murder, but murder of one's own brother. Here too, the Yahwist has made use of older stories with mythological overtones. These elements borrowed include the traditional conflict between the farmer and the sheep herder. More current, those that live in cities against those that reside in rural areas. The genealogies of Genesis chapters 4 through 5 begin after the story of Cain and Abel. The Yahwist adds a list of Cain's descendants, emphasizing those who gave the world the civilized gifts of music and ironworking, and concludes with the increase of violence and revenge among these descendants. In Genesis 4:25, the Yahwist records how Adam had a new son, Seth, and how this marked a positive turnaround for the human race. From that time on, the people began to call God by his name, Yahweh. At this point, the priestly author inserts his own genealogy of the 10 descendants of Adam down to Noah. Many of the names are similar to those in the J list of Genesis 4, and probably stem from an old tradition that had been passed down through the centuries in different forms. The first 7 names in the J list correspond closely to names in the P list: Adam, Adam, Cain, Canaan, Arad, Yarad, Muhajael, Mahalael, etc. But what has always interested readers is the long lifespan that P credits to his patriarchs. This was not intended as proof that humans lived to such old ages in the first days of the world, but more of a literary device to show the superiority of the beginning times and how vastly different they were from our own. The Sumerian king list, only one of many examples from the ancient Near East, lists the names and ages of the kings who lived before the flood in the tens of thousands of years. King Alulim reigned 28,800 years. King Alagar reigned 36,000 years, etc. Some Hindu traditions are even more exaggerated. One myth speaks of the perfect first age of the world when humans stood 6 miles high and lived 8.4 million years. One of the most fascinating and controversial stories in Genesis, the story of the giants, belongs in style and approach to the Yahwist. This documents the reason for the upcoming flood story. If humans killing one another was not bad enough, the world became worse when God's divine beings violated the very limits set for humanity at creation. These divine beings were considered lesser gods in earlier thought and became angels in later theology. Originally, the story explained why there had been giants in the old days, a widespread ancient belief, as we can see from other references to giants in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 20, and chapter 3, verse 11. This is revisited later in the story of David and Goliath. The Yahwist viewed the existence of giants as a sign of the extreme abnormality caused by sin in the world. This fully merited the destruction and purification that the flood would bring. A second interpretation of this section of the book of Genesis is provided by Alfred Edersheim from his work called Bible History of the Old Testament. He reveals a more logical approach to the story and demonstrates the conflict between the two groups of men inhabiting the earth at the time, those evil descendants of Cain and the holy descendants of Seth. The corruption of mankind reached its highest point when even the difference between the Sethites and the Cainites became obliterated by the intermarriages between the two parties, and that from sensual motives. We read that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives, of all which they chose. Properly speaking, these Nephilim, their offspring, were men of violence or tyrants. They began a period of intense violence upon the earth, and faith and worship in God disappeared. With the corruption of both the Sethites and Cainites, no further hope remained, and these people were condemned to be swept away in judgment. Ancient Israelites undoubtedly fully believed that a flood had once destroyed the earth. Indeed, almost every nation around them also believed that a major flood had occurred near the beginning of time. But Israel also understood that the story of Noah was not just history in the ordinary sense. It was also a religious lesson told in mythological language about how God's mercy and promise far exceeded any terrible disaster to human life. The J and P stories of the flood are closely joined in one of the most dramatic episodes in the Old Testament. P has built on the older J tradition, so that the disaster leads to a moment in Genesis 9 when God renews his blessing on humankind that matches the first blessing to Adam in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. We can detect certain signs that there were two original accounts of the flood story in the fact that God announces the flood twice, and twice promises never to send a flood again. Noah is told to take a pair of each kind of animal in some passages, but 7 pairs of clean animals with 1 pair of unclean in others. There also seems to be 2 different numbering systems at work, one based on 7 and 40-day periods, the other on longer lengths that add up to a full year. The J and P share a single message, however. When God decides he must punish the world for its sin, he spares the one man who has been faithful to him by allowing Noah to ride out the flood on an ark. When the disaster is over, God restores the covenant with the world through this man. The climax for the J version comes in Genesis chapter 8, verse 20 through 22, in which God's forgiveness extends even to lifting the curse upon the earth for what humans have done in their hearts. People may still choose sin, but the goodness of God and his everlasting mercy will be seen in the bounty and the regularity of nature's seasons. As long as the earth lasts, planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, will never cease. P's climax comes in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1 through 7, where God renews the blessing of Genesis 1 on the human beings. P even enlarges the covenant conditions so that now people may eat meat as well as plants, thus removing the last restrictions on their rule over the creatures of the world. But with it comes an increased obligation to respect human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in God's image has God made man. Genesis 9:6. If you watched our series on the ancient Near East, we focused on the epic of Gilgamesh and the flood. To review briefly, it tells how the hero, King Gilgamesh, is so much greater than his subjects that he tyrannizes them. To divert his attention, a goddess makes a companion for him nearly as strong as he is. They become fast friends and embark on a series of exploits, killing the great Humbaba, who guards the cedar forest of the gods, rejecting the love of the goddess Ishtar, and then slaying the bull of the god Anu. The gods decree that Enkidu, his friend, must die, and this leads Gilgamesh on a quest for immortality. He goes to the ends of the earth where he has heard that the hero of the original flood, Utnapishtim, has been given immortality by the gods. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood and how the gods had blessed him for his role in saving humanity. He does this all in order to point out to Gilgamesh that he cannot hope for personal immortality. And although the details of the Babylonian flood are remarkably similar to those in Genesis, the point of the Babylonian version is always this lesson in the mortality of human beings. Gilgamesh himself is sent home to his capital city of Uruk, disappointed but wiser. There his adventures end as he resumes his duties. The final episode contains a melancholy description of the underworld by the ghost of his friend Enkidu. This is to be man's fate, even for Gilgamesh, because the gods reserve everlasting life for themselves. Early models of the same story are known from about 2000 BC in Sumerian, and the setting is always somewhere in Mesopotamia. There is no question that the biblical account of the flood is a later development or offshoot from the Babylonian version. The differences in detail, such as the size of the ark, or the length of time that the water stayed on the land, or the types of birds, may argue that the biblical writers knew a slightly different version, perhaps one from an area closer to them, such as Syria. Like their neighbors, Israel believed that a flood, like the giants, or the long lifespan of the primal humans, or the struggle of the first humans to be like gods, was part of the way it was in the beginning. Where Israel's version is unique was in its understanding of God. The Babylonians believed in a mysterious tension between gods and humans. This usually resulted in wrathful actions by the gods because the humans annoyed them and disturbed their peace. The Babylonians felt a great deal of uncertainty about what the gods wanted and what would please them. Israel, in contrast, believed that God was always the same, always faithful, and always loving toward the creatures he had made. To the Israelites, God only punished for clear moral evil and was always quick to forgive. Genesis chapter 10 provides a list of the world's nations, which are divided among the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These generally reflect the three major groupings of people in Hebrew world geography. Shem includes the Aramaeans, Assyrians, and Arabs, all Semites to the east. Ham includes the Semitic peoples in the west, the Canaanites and the people of North Africa, Egyptians, Libyans, and Sudanese. Japheth generally includes the non-Semitic peoples of the north and Aegean, the Greeks, Hittites, and people of Cyprus. The priestly editors created the final form by adding, especially in Genesis 10, verse 1 through 7, to an older list used by the Yahwist. Their purpose was to show how God's restored blessing after the flood led to even more fertility and success than before the flood. With Genesis chapter 11, the J ended his account of the beginning of the world with the story of the Tower of Babel, noting that sin did not disappear with the flood. The human race still prided itself on its own glory and rebelled against God. This act was apparent in its creation of the Tower of Babel. The Babylonians regularly raised these huge ziggurats to their gods. J delighted in showing God's punishment for such human pride. The nations are so scattered and so closed off by scrambled language that they will never even cooperate with one another, much less challenge God. Genesis 11 closes with the genealogy of Abraham. The genealogy list of the priestly author from chapter 5 is continued. It bridges the final distance between mythical time to historical time by listing the generations from Noah to the first patriarch, Abraham. Theologically, P makes the point that God had given up on humanity as a whole after the Tower of Babel, and instead narrow his choice to one man and one nation who would learn obedience and devotion to God and eventually bring this knowledge and divine blessing to all other people. Thus, with Abraham, the Bible begins to deal with people and places actually known to exist. Interestingly, archaeology has revealed that many of the names listed in Genesis 11:27 through 32 as Abraham's close relatives were actually the names of towns near Haran in Mesopotamia. This is a symbolic way of expressing Abraham's roots in that area. With this new beginning, we leave the stage of myth and prologue and enter the historical world of biblical Israel.